Welcome to the Changelog episode 0.5.6. I'm Adam Stacoviak.
And I'm Wynn. This is the Changelog. We cover what's fresh and new and open source. If you found us on iTunes, we're also on the web at thechangelog.com. We're also up on GitHub.
Head to github.com/explore. You'll find some training repos, some feature repos from the blog, as well as our audio podcasts. If you're on Twitter, follow Changelog Show. And me, Adam Stack.
And I'm Penguin, Pengwynn. Fun episode this week. Talked to some masters of Vim. We talked to Drew over at Vimcast, Tim Pope from HashRocket, and Yehuda of Janus fame.
Nice lineup.
A nice lineup indeed. Talking everybody's favorite cutting-edge 1960s technology, as Dr. Nick said.
There you go.
So it seems to be the hot editor. I know there's some Emacs lovers out there. Save your email. But Vim seems to be what everybody that is waiting on the heralded TextMate 2.0 is waiting on. They're switching over to Vim.
Oh boy, yeah. I don't even want to talk about TextMate. That's a bad subject.
I'm a TextMate user. I know that you are too. A lot of people are switching over to Sublime, but it's not open source, so really aren't going to talk about it on this podcast.
Yeah, that's right.
But everybody's wanting to try Vim, as am I, so we figured we'd have some experts and talk about setups and macros and kind of the history of how they got into Vim. It's really interesting, I thought.
Yeah.
We'll be at Red Dirt RubyConf next week. Plug that one more time before we head up to Oklahoma City. April 21st, 22nd. Going to be talking Ruby, Rails, JavaScript, and doing some Titanium training. So if you haven't got your ticket yet and you want to go, be sure and get it before they sell out. Fun episode this week. Should we get to it?
Let's do it.
All right, we're chatting today with some Vim experts on everybody's favorite command line text editor. So before we jump into Vim, let's get some introductions. So Drew, you're up first. Why don't you introduce yourself and a little bit about how you came to Vim?
Hi, my name's Drew Neal, and how did it start? I used to use TextMate, and then I switched to Vim when I started working at a company where I had to use Linux. I no longer had access to a Mac, so I could have gone with gedit, but I chose Vim. I'd kind of been toying with it for a long time before that, but this just gave me the push. So I started using Vim full time, and it took me a while, but eventually I started to really love it, and I wanted to start sharing with people the tricks that I was learning. So I started the Vimcasts blog and podcast. And so that's why I'm here today.
We'll jump into Vimcast in just a moment. Tim?
I started using Vim about a decade ago when Emacs was a little too hard for me. Since then, I've taken to writing plugins. People probably know, but I've written Rails.vim, Fugitive, Surround, several others, and maintain several dozen runtime files that ship with Vim.
And Yehuda, you are, I guess, shying away from the Vim expert label, but for those that don't know you, who are you?
I'm Yehuda. I work on a bunch of open source projects, probably most notably jQuery and Rails. My day job these days is mostly working on the Sprout Core framework. I, like a lot of other people, used TextMate for a while, and I'm also not a person who switched to Vim because I wanted to be able to SSH into a server and use it. I was frustrated by a bunch of limitations in TextMate that I eventually stopped talking myself out of as being limitations, and I saw a bunch of people working productively in Vim, tried many times to use it, and was frequently told that I needed to dive in, go cold turkey, etc. And that never worked for me because I was never willing to give up 2 weeks to learn Vim. And I eventually decided that the way I would learn Vim is to pretend it was TextMate and turn on all the things that let you do that. And it was actually extremely smooth. Within an hour, I was approximately as productive as I was on TextMate. And as a person who hacks tools and likes to customize my environment, I quickly got into building plugins using plugins, and then I ended up saying this seems like a problem. Everybody wants to have plugins, and I guess everyone uses TPOP stuff, but there's a few other things that I care about. Plus, I'm doing a few different things than Tim is, so there's these plugins that I want, and wouldn't it be great if everyone in my office could use the same thing? So I ended up building a distribution of common plugins that I now maintain.
We're going to jump into those plugins just a moment, but a couple episodes ago, we had Dr. Nick from Engine Yard on the podcast, and he says he prefers TextMate instead of 1960s technology. So, Drew, what would you say to Dr. Nick?
Well, I guess he probably uses Unix, though, doesn't he?
Touché.
Also, how old? Vim isn't that old. Like I guess what is
Draw a distinction between VI and Vim?
Yeah,
probably?
like Vim it's a tool that has been around for a while, like a lot of other tools, like Lisp or whatever. But that doesn't mean that it, like when they created it, then the next year they were like, I guess we're done, no more, right? Obviously, it continues to be developed. So, I in general, people like I think that's a good laugh line that people say about a lot of things, but it's always a kind of weird laugh line because all it really means is that people have been working on it for a long time. It doesn't actually mean that it's out of date or anything like that.
So, Tim, you mentioned Emacs. So what? Usually that's the equivalence, and maybe it's a false equivalence that people present. Are you a Vim or Emacs guy? Then kind of snicker if you're a TextMate guy. So you mentioned Emacs. What's the difference between Emacs and Vim for you?
Nowadays it's mostly about the modal editing. Just once you get into that mindset, it's hard to go back. At the time, my difficulty approaching it was mostly just because you had to learn Lisp at the same time, and I always found myself editing my .emacs file in another editor just when I get stuck. And
so, Drew, what was the motivation behind Vimcasts?
Well, when I switched to Vim, Yehuda's Janus plugin, or distribution rather, wasn't available. So I spent, I don't know, I mean, it was a couple of months while I was sort of trying out plugins, discarding them, trying out something else, just trying to get comfortable. For people starting out today, they can try out Janus and just have this really easy step to Vim. But at the time, I'd constantly be searching the web and trying to find stuff about Vim, and there's a lot of good stuff out there all over the place, but I couldn't really find any one place that gave a lot of the answers that I was looking for. So I started Vimcasts to try to be that place, basically. So that was the motivation behind it, really. I just I suppose the other thing is that there are some things about learning to use a text editor that I think don't work so well as a blog post. It's when it comes to learning to code, you can check out someone's open source project and you can study it. You can use it as reading matter, and you can see why they're doing certain things. And it doesn't matter what text editor or IDE they were using. If someone designs a class in a particular way, it's going to end up having those lines of code, regardless of which editor they used. There's something about the process of going from an idea to a piece of code. It's very transient. You don't see the actual process of editing. And so people can be extremely productive with their editors, but unless someone actually sees them doing these little tricks and tips, they could die with them, the screencast format really works for showing how Vim works, because there's just things which, to describe it in a blog post, it would just be really difficult to write, and it would be difficult to read. But in 15 seconds, you can show something, and people just get it. So I know when I've picked a good topic when I go to write up the show notes, and there's almost nothing for me to write because it's just just watch the screencast. I can't really describe this.
Well, I highly recommend those screencasts, also the Peep Code video. But you mentioned blog posts a couple of times. So, Yehuda, you've got one that says anyone that everyone who tried to convince me to use Vim was wrong. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess that was a troll title. So, like I said before, I repeatedly found myself frustrated with TextMate, and repeatedly was told by other people to use either Emacs or Vim, and repeatedly was told by Vim people that I need to turn off the arrow keys and learn to do it correctly, quote unquote. And I think that there's probably, from a pure perspective, that's probably correct. I think if you're willing to do that, if you could go to a 2-week training seminar where they're all you're going to do is use Vim, I think that's probably right. But I think, like a lot of people, I use my editor for my day-to-day work, and I can't just be I guess the next 2 weeks I'll get nothing done because I'll be learning my editor. So I routinely would try Vim, and like get told by people that I was doing it wrong and like just be like, forget it, I don't have time right now, I'm just going to go back to TextMate, despite the things that I found frustrating about it. And I eventually was just like, no, I'm going to pretend it's TextMate. I'm going to, I don't really care about productivity right now. I care about being able to write code because I have a job. And once I did that, I realized that it was very easy. It was like, Vim, editors are editors, right? So you have to sort of understand that there's this modal concept, but actually you could live in insert mode a lot for a while before you need to learn that there's like this other mode. And it wasn't very hard. So I wrote the post mostly out of frustration. Like, I am now a couple weeks in and it wasn't hard. And why did it feel so hard? Everybody in the world who thinks it's hard, like it actually turns out to not be hard.
You know, one of the things that I love about TextMate is just the ecosystem of bundles that are around it. And, you know, I think TextMate 2 has become the next Duke Nukem. So one of the things that appealed to me was having my editor on any platform, but I'm going to miss all those bundles. So Tim, when you set out on this Vim approach, what was the plugin landscape and what was the first plugin you wrote?
I started fooling around with writing like syntax highlighting files and simple stuff early on, but I didn't really get into it until I found Rails. And then I went and checked, is there a plugin for Rails? No, there's not. I came back a month later, still went, and I was like, well, I got to write it myself. So 5,000 lines later, we've got Rails.vim. So
Yehuda, how much of Tim's plugins have made it into Janus?
I think like almost all of them. Anyone that I didn't put initially. I think Pathogen is the only one that, mostly because I'm being lazy, isn't in there yet. But I keep, mostly because switching to Pathogen will require some like large changes to the system. But pretty much anything that anybody uses that's useful has been submitted as a patch and accepted. There's a bunch of other stuff that is more complicated, like Nerd. Like I have a fork of Nerd Tree that I hacked up to like look prettier and work more like how I wanted it to. And I guess the thing about Vim plugins is that they're sort of like Rails plugins in that Tim's work really well together because he uses all of them. But half the work of making a plugin work well inside of Janus is just like, okay, I've inserted it. It now breaks some other plugin. Can I fix that? Can I remove it? Maybe there's a configuration option. So Janus to me is sort of like, it is like Rails itself in that it's just trying to make sure that everything is integrated well. It's not so much about like, there is a certain amount of like which alignment plugin is the best plugin or which tab completion plugin is the best plugin, and we move on until we find the right one. But then there's also like, how do we make it work well with Nerd Tree? It's like a big part of it. Or how do we make it work well with Command T?
So Janus is geared primarily towards OS 10 and Mac Vim, but it does work on Linux, correct?
I don't know if that's so. The answer is supposed to be yes, but Carl recently tried it on Linux and was like, this doesn't work at all. So I think there's probably some bug that makes it not work, and that will be addressed rapidly. Carl is a person who is using Vim because he wants to use it on Linux, so making it work on Linux is a priority right now. It initially did. So something broke somewhere along the line.
So Drew, where do you get ideas for Vimcast episodes?
Just through using it. I'll spot myself doing something and think, that's useful and it's maybe not obvious. So I should do a screencast about it. When I started out, I was determined not to do stuff on plugins because I think there's so much that you need to learn about the core functionality. So the first, I'm trying to think. The first time I covered a plugin was maybe episode 29 or even 30 or something. Up until then, it was all core functionality. So that's how I started out. But lately, I've started writing a book about Vim. Which is going to be published by the Pragmatic Programmers. And my focus there is to focus on core Vim functionality. So as long as I'm writing this book, all of my ideas about working with the core functionality of the editor, they're going into the book rather than into the screencast. So lately I've started sort of drawing up a list of the plugins that I find really useful and I want to show people how I use them. So yeah, I've got a big list of ideas, and I just sort of pick whichever one I feel like doing at the time, usually.
So I know that Tim and Yehuda are both Rubyists. Hopefully I'm not boxing them in with that term, but how about you?
Yeah, I'm a Rubyist too. Though lately I've been using JavaScript more. Pretty much full time, in fact. So, yeah, but I mean, one of the reasons I chose Vim, I think Rails.Vim certainly had something to do with it. It's so useful when you're working on a Rails project. So,
yeah, I think interestingly, so I am also in the same position. I do a lot of Ruby. I write Ruby pretty much every day, but I spend a lot more time with JavaScript these days. And it seems like the ecosystem around Ruby, probably because of Tim, is a lot more robust. Like there's issues like you delete a line in the JavaScript mode and it like takes a second because there's some bug somewhere in one of the canonical JavaScript plugins. So maybe JavaScript just needs a JavaScript Tim, or maybe, yeah. But at the end of the day, like Vim is nice because it has all these plugins, but there's definitely like differences in quality between things that are heavily maintained by a community of users and like things that are there, you know, like people like me. I use Ruby, I also use JavaScript. I want it to work with Vim, so I make it work somehow, and that's not as good.
So how much easier or more difficult is it to write a plugin for Vim as opposed to TextMate?
If you're asking me, I don't know. I've never written a TextMate plugin.
So I can answer that actually. I think it is harder, but you can do more. So TextMate is very like Unixy. There's like input output. You just do your thing and you like shell out essentially to programs, and it's your access to what is going on in the editor is very weak. But that limitation, I think, encourages creativity. So people like work around it in creative ways. Where Vim's plugins are extremely powerful, and and you can even like write them in Ruby if you want, and still have access to the editor context. So you can do it in TextMate, but then you're like shelling out to a Ruby process and like looking at environment variables. And Vim like gives you a runtime that is sensible, awesome. But because there's more things going on, it's if all you ever did was TextMate plugins, you'll perhaps be a little lost. And I think the universe could use a like how to write a Vim plugin tutorial that is better than what exists right now. Maybe I just haven't seen it, and it's awesome and it exists.
Are you guys Vim color, I guess, customizers, or do you have a preference for your favorite syntax highlighting in Vim as opposed to regular terminal?
I use my own vividchalk. It's based on that vibrantink for TextMate.
So Janus ships with IR Black, which I like a lot, mainly because it. I think there's a few of them like this, but IR Black does a good job of making it not look like you're in a text mode editor, and I actually like the fact that Janus makes it feel more, more modern. But I saw there was some new theme that was posted on Hacker News that actually looked like it might be better, and I wanted to try it out and see if it's better.
Was that solarized?
Yes. Solarized.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've been trying that one out.
I need to try it out and like for a couple days and see if it's like obviously bad or obviously better.
You know what impressed me about Solarized was the fact that it kind of turned the theme sideways, where usually you pick your editor or you pick your product and then you pick from themes that were available for that, right? Where Solarized is kind of the opposite approach. It's all these different programs bundled together in one theme.
Yeah, and it seems like he spent a lot of time thinking about the theory behind it in ways that seemed sensible to me when I read his post.
So Drew, Ryan Bates over at Railscast, I know his TextMate theme got popular because he used it in his screencast. So what about Vimcast? Do you have your own?
I've been using the Blackboard theme, which there's a few out there. It was the theme that I used when I used TextMate, and I just got used to it. So when I switched to Vim, I looked around, and I think there were a few ports out there. I picked one of them, and I've been customizing it for myself. I just use it because I like it, and it looks, well, like I say, it was the one that I used in TextMate. Although lately, I mean, one of the things that people often say at conferences, when people put up code snippets in their slides, if they use a dark background, quite often it's very, very difficult to read for the people in the audience. So I think it's really important to have a light theme, even if you don't like using a light theme from day to day, just to have a light theme that you know is there, and you know you can switch it on if you're at a conference and you're live demoing something or something like that. So one of the light themes that I liked in TextMate was called Mac Classic, and I ported that one over to Vim. And in fact, I've tended to use that one more than Blackboard. Just because it was kind of, while something like that is a work in progress, suddenly you'll find yourself working on a file with a syntax that you don't use maybe day to day, and you realize, oh, this one really needs some attention. So if you're developing a color theme, it's really good to just use it all the time, so that you become aware of the gaps.
You know, when I'm coding, I prefer a dark theme as well, but I'm also writing a book, and when I'm writing in Markdown large chunks of text for the book, I really prefer a white background or a light background, just because it's easier on the eyes when I'm doing non-coding work. How about you when you're writing for Prog?
Yeah, I use a light theme as well when I'm writing pages of text. I agree. It just feels better somehow. One of the things that the chap behind Solarized said, he said, you know, when you're outdoors reading a book, you've got white pages with black text, and generally you don't go out and sit in direct sunlight. That's normally too bright and too much contrast. Normally you'll try and find a shady spot so that effectively it lowers the contrast. You end up with the shadow on the page. It's no longer pure white. So one of the principles behind Solarized is to lower that contrast and make it more like reading a book in the shade rather than in the bright sunlight. So I've in the last few days I've switched to Solarized, and I've been enjoying it. I like the look of it. Look at this light yellow background, which I find quite uplifting. There's a few things that don't quite, I guess, you know, just a few gaps, but I guess they'll be taken care of in time.
So I think you said something that sounded right to me, that like crystallized something that I've been thinking, which is I think it's easier to get good contrast in a dark color. So when I'm writing code, it actually is important for me to see like that is a variable, that is a class, that is a method, right? That is a string. So I want something that enables me to have a lot of colors, where on a light background, you get much better contrast. So it's good for like writing big blocks of text, like if I'm writing a blog post or something, but it's much worse for writing code for me, because there's only like a few colors. You have to make the text dark, right? So then you're like dark red and dark blue and dark whatever, right? But you can't really have a lot of different colors, and so it becomes less useful. So I agree, and I also agree that at conferences, because of the contrast issue, it is like way more important to be able to have your text be readable than to have it be like this is a string, it is in green.
Any Sprout Core plugins for Vim?
Someone actually just posted to the mailing list about that. There aren't, to me, a higher priority than that would be making the JavaScript ones work. Like there's massive indentation issues. There's some like weird performance stuff, maybe related to JSLint, but I have doubts. Sprout Core itself is there are the sorts of the same things that you could do with Rails. Like I'm in a controller now, so I can do certain things, and you can have snippets and all that. But there is enough pain in the Vim JavaScript experience right now that if I was going to spend time on it, I would work on that. But I think there has been enough interest in it that I think it will probably happen, like specific Sprout Core stuff.
One of the interesting things happening for all JavaScript development, not just in Vim at the moment, you know, the guys at Mozilla are behind this, what's it called, JS CTags, which is, I think it runs on Node, or it runs on V8 through Node. And that allows, well, basically CTags has been around for a long time, and it's got support for a lot of languages, but it's always been terrible at introspecting on JavaScript code, because, you know, the language is so sort of free, and there's so many ways you can define a function and add things to a namespace. And JS CTags understands almost all of them. I think it passes most of the tests that I've thrown at it. So, yeah, I'm excited about seeing that.
I think the way you should think about JavaScript is that every large framework is its own language, because there is no yet class API in JavaScript. So you actually want something that knows that sc.object.extend is a class, right? And you could try to introspect, like JS.toolkit tries to figure it out, but at the end of the day, in JS.toolkit, you have to say like scope blah, because it doesn't know that that's a class, and it can only guess so much, right? So the way I would think, I would want there to be a C tags for Sprout Core, a C tags for MooTools, because you want something that is like has deeper. You're essentially building a language on top of Java. It's like Lisp, right? It's like clause, what Sprout Core, MooTools, or whatever are. So you want something that is more than just like I see a bunch of functions and their keys, so probably that's a class. Maybe you want something that knows what Sprout Core is.
So we had Ilya Grigorik on the show recently, and he told him that we we're going to be talking about Vim. So he reminded me of his excellent site, Vim Golf. So wanted to throw it out there and see if you guys have used Vim Golf and maybe what your high scores are.
Yeah, I've used it. I'm not very good at it, actually. I think it's an amazing site. I haven't dipped into the source code to find out how he's done it, but it just kind of strikes me as magic, the way you just fire it up and it tracks all your keystrokes and reports them back to his web service. It's brilliant. It's great fun, and I've learnt a lot from seeing the way other people tackle these problems.
So I actually, sorry, proceed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just like code golf, you end up doing things that you would never do ordinarily, and I think sometimes minimizing the number of keystrokes. I don't know. You have to think really hard about coming up with a good Vim golf solution. Whereas I think in general day-to-day usage, you just want your fingers to act on your thought and for the thing to happen. And I don't really care if it takes 5 keystrokes instead of 3. It's more important for me that it's repeatable with the dot command, for example, or something like that. So I've definitely got entertainment from it, and I've picked up a few tricks. But I think when you look at a solution that someone uses, it's very much kind of influenced by the golfing mindset of trying to minimize your keystrokes. It's probably not something you do in the real world.
Yeah, I sort of have the same approach to coding. I have so much available RAM before I start swapping in my brain, and trying to remember more than a few key combinations doesn't work for me. It basically makes me a worse coder. So to the extent that I can get muscle memory, that's great, and that those things are very, very important. To the extent that I have to be like, how do I do that thing again? That actually is worse for me than just doing it longhand. And I often will do things longhand, or get into a pattern. I use visual block mode a lot because I know how to do it, right? I know how to use it. And even though I'm sure, every time I do it, somebody's like, oh, you can actually just type in this 5 keystrokes and it will do the whole thing you just did in 10. And it doesn't, I don't have space in my brain to remember all those things, which this is why I don't think I'm a Vim expert, actually. And I also am not very good at Vim Golf, but I actually hadn't looked at it in a while, and I see he added your ability to see other people's answers, which was not there in the initial release, which makes it more interesting to me in general.
It's almost like refactor my code, but as you said, some of these solutions get a bit esoteric. But I guess as long as it's your own process, it's not that bad. Sometimes less is not more when it comes to code, like in Ruby inline procs and things sometimes get a bit hard to read if you don't exactly know what's going on under the hood. But for keystrokes, I guess you're the only one consuming them.
Yep, and I think in particular, I think it is probably the case that it's a very personal thing. I think people who are like, you should use this code motion. I think different people have a different tolerance for memorization, and also a different amount of utility from repetition. So Vim is nice. It gives you a lot of tools. It's very much like Ruby and not Python in that way. It gives you a million ways to do it. And I feel as long as you're productive in it, you're happy. It's good.
I guess I should ask your favorite terminal that you're running Vim in.
I use ZSH, but I use MacVim. So
not your shell, but you're using MacVim. You're not using a iTerm or just built-in terminal.
No, and I actually. So again, I think this makes me a heretic, but I like hitting Apple S to save things. So I of course know how to do the right way, right? But I actually like. This is sort of an answer to the 1960s browser thing, right? I think MacVim actually solves a bunch of things that are kind of annoying about Vim for day-to-day usage, and so I like it, and I tend to not just be like, oh, I guess I'm in the terminal, I can just type in Vim and now I'm in Vim. I tend to want to use MacVim.
So that's actually a great point. I work with Nathan Smith, the 960 grid system guy, and so one of the things that we were talking about in moving to Vim, because a couple of guys on the team are Vim guys, and he said, what I do with my OCD Command S twice on every time I want to reload and save the page. So I guess we have an answer for him. MacVim.
I figure there's I guess that there's utility in memorizing or knowing that, or having a muscle memory of :W, but I already have 20 years of muscle memory on Apple S, and I really don't see the utility of unmemorizing that and memorizing a different thing for Vim specifically.
Yeah, I would second that, actually. Exactly. I think Vim is very much set up. It encourages you, if you are creating your own mappings, it encourages you not to use modifier keys like the command key and the control key. But I think there's cases where it's much better to do that, particularly, the example of hitting Command S twice. And anything where you need to do something many times, I think it's much better to create a mapping that uses a modifier key. One that springs to mind that I use actually is, when you press J, it moves you down a line. And normally you would expect it to move down a display line, but Vim always moves down by a numbered line. So if you have a long paragraph that's wrapped, say it's 5 lines long and it's wrapped, and you press the J key, it'll move you down to the line below rather than moving you down. So I'm not describing that well. It'll move you onto the blank line below the paragraph rather than moving you onto the line of text below the line of text that you're on.
It's especially bad if you're writing paragraphs of text.
Yeah, it's quite infuriating, and the Vim it does have the option to let you move down by a display line rather than a numbered line, but you have to hit GJ, and I find that if I need to move down five lines, basically that's 10 keystrokes. It's GJ, 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 GJ. Hammering, it's like doing a drum roll, and I find it really easy to accidentally hit GJJ, or it's really easy to mess up. And in that case, I've got it set up so I just hold down Command and hit J, and it does the display lines rather than the numbered lines. So that's one case where I think the Vim custom of always typing something that sounds like a word rather than doing a modifier key mapping. I think that's one case where it's much better to use a modifier key. Another one
I use a lot is there's a port of the TextMate indenting and outdenting blocks of code thing. So instead of doing double right angle, you do command right bracket. I can't say this out loud at all. That's horrible. But so for the first 2 months I used Vim, I didn't know about it, and I was just using the angle brackets, and I got good at it. I'm reasonable, especially once I learned about period. But it's actually nice. It's annoying that when you do that, you lose what was highlighted. Often you want to do something with it, and I just like how the TextMate one works better. And of course, you can implement it in Vim, and it is. So I use that a lot. And yeah, I feel like the wrong case for modifier keys is when you're in insert mode. In insert mode, modifier keys are just craziness. But in move mode and a visual block mode, it's good.
Tim, you have a favorite set of modifier keys or tricks?
I'm kind of a curmudgeon in that regard. I've got a few. I mean, basically stuff I've learned since switching to a Mac. So when I run my tests, I hit Command R, but I learned :W about 10 years ago, and it's so hardwired now.
Yeah, so that's actually what I mean. I think it's good for everyone to have their own muscle memory. I actually think it's bad for the Vim community to be I guess there's not really a Vim community, but it's bad for people who are helping people learn Vim to be you have command :W, that's how you have to do it, or whatever the things are. I think it's better for people to learn their own path because everyone's different, which makes me sound like a hippie, but that's not really what I mean.
Anybody use VI mode for their terminal when they're just messing around the shell?
I can't stand VI mode. Without. I mean, I don't get anything I like from Vim. I don't get a colon line. I can't :S anything. I can't even tell which mode I'm in. So.
Yeah, the only thing is I get confused. So I learned all of the Emacs combos, not from Emacs, but from Bash, and so I'm pretty used to them. But I'm losing my muscle memory from them because I use Vim so much now. where before TextMate is like very Emacsy in terms of key combinations. So it's just sometimes weird context.
I've actually mapped those in insert mode and command line mode in my Vim. That's my habit. Right? I still have Control B and Control F, Control A, Control E. Those I use regularly in Vim.
How would the world be different if DHH's original Rails screencast had been done in Vim?
I think TextMate has the property of being like 0 seconds to pick up, like Rails actually. And I think Vim is like we see a lot of adoption now because Rails is maturing. So there's like I don't think that many people actually use Vim. If like let's say there's 2 million Rails developers, I don't think like any noticeable percentage of those people actually use Vim. But I think among the people like the growing up, maturing community of Rails, we're like moving into more mature tools.
So Yehuda is, his reputation comes from being on the core team of Rails and jQuery. And Tim, the outcry on Twitter when I put out the call for Vim guys was great with your screen name. I guess you may have a Vim tattoo or something, or maybe just your plugins that you have reputation. But I wanted to know, Drew, does every Brit just automatically go into voiceover and screencast work? I mean, how does your accent translate into street cred?
It's been quite surprising to learn that people like my voice. I mean, just like everyone, I don't like my own voice. When I hear it coming back to me, I'm like, whoa, do I sound like that? God. But yeah, it's quite strange. People seem to like my voice, which I guess is good. And I'm just trying to make the most of that by doing more screencasts. So I guess the reason I got into screencasting is because I love teaching, and it's a good way to reach an audience. And I really, I don't know, I really enjoy it when there's something that's difficult, and which you invest some time getting your head around it, communicating that to people who haven't invested that time, making it easier for them to reach that point of understanding. I get a real kick out of that. So. I do it because I enjoy teaching. I think that's the main reason. And Vim is such it's famously difficult to pick up, and so there's a lot of meat there for me to get into. So
I'll put you guys on the spot real quick with a couple of closing questions. So first, any command line hacks or other tool chain tips that you'd like to share with our listeners as far as creating code?
One stupid simple one that I was reminded of earlier. I don't like VI bindings in the command line, but you can bind. I think it's bound by default in Bash, and I've bound it in Z Shell as well. CTRL-X, Control-E to open an editor to edit the current command line. So if I'm trying to do something a little fancier when editing, and I want a real editor, I use that fairly regularly.
So I actually find it somewhat surprising that Ruby-E and associate like Ruby-P are not more commonly used. Half of why people use Perl is because of those things, and Matt's like dutifully copied the exact API from Perl. And so I am often like piping things to Ruby-E, blah, blah, blah. And I think I may be the only one. Like when I found out about -P, which is like a printing thing, I was surprised. Like I'd never heard of it, and I like asked people about it, and nobody knows about it either. So I would just say, like, if you're going to use grep and you're like, oh, I don't really know that API, you know Ruby's regular expression syntax, so just use Ruby-E. It's fine. It will work great.
I've got one, not for the regular command line, but for Vim's command line. Lately, I've been using more and more the Control-R. Opens up the next key that you press. It'll paste from the register of the key that you press. So I've been using this more and more lately. You can... in particular, if you do Control-R /, / is the register that contains your last search pattern, and I've been finding that really useful lately. So, and the other one is Control-R, Control-W will paste the word under your cursor. I just really been enjoying that lately. So
neat.
One last question, and this is really going to put you on the spot. Who's your programming hero?
So I think Matt's is underrated, or maybe not. Maybe he's rated well. There's a bunch of things that Matt's wrote and was interviewed on circa 2003. I keep meaning to like put a blog post up that has a list of them. But Matt's around that time like elucidated a lot of things about Ruby, and some of them are like, he says like optimize for programmer happiness or like for humans or whatever, and I think it's like a catchphrase now. People who know Ruby now know it, but he actually enumerated exactly what it means, and I found the way he talks about it to be very useful for designing other things, for like working on Rails or Sprout Core, like how should you think about the problem, and I do think he's underrated.
I guess I'll have to go with Linus Torvalds. I mean, he's changed my life twice over now. First with Linux, then with Git. It's just, when does he stop?
I don't know if I have a hero.
It's okay to say no. The reason I start asking that question is because it's just one of our field changes so fast, and it's one of those things where baseball players and other occupations have someone to look up to even from an early age, and computing is one of those things that sometimes you get into later in life, and you really don't have that role model as you come up through the ranks.
I think it's still plausible to like have Kernighan and Ritchie as role models. People who were role models in the 60s are still very relevant.
Indeed. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate the time, and I know that I'm continuing on my own personal discovery with Vim, as a lot of the listeners are, and so hopefully we're smarter for it.
Awesome. Thank you very much.